Hi everyone, this lecture focuses on immigration and should provide background information necessary for the final. So this particular first image is from the New York Times Immigration Explorer, and what it does is it provides an overview of where we see the largest foreign-born group in each country, from each country. So starting at the northern part, looking at northern Washington, northern Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, what you see is that sort of green. And so, not surprisingly, the largest foreign born group in that area are actually Canadians because we're right up against the US Canadian border. Then, sort of dropping down to the bottom left of this graphic, it's mostly in sort of shades of pink or kind of a reddish type of color or rose kind of color. This area, in terms of the southwest of the United States, represents probably the hottest zone for immigration, and the greatest concentration of people in this area come from Latin America, and even more specifically from Mexico. And if you also look at the bottom right corner at Florida, of course, you also have a heavy Latin American population there, as well as in North Carolina, as well as Pennsylvania and New York. The difference, though, between the Southwest and then the Eastern Seaboard areas is that the populations, as I've noted, ranging from California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, are predominantly Mexican, whereas in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, all the way up the seaboard, these are really Latinos from the islands area. So the Dominican Republic and Florida, that red area is predominantly representative of Cubans, Haitians, so Puerto Ricans, etc., that are all from those particular parts of the country. So take a closer look at this. You will see the sort of different pockets. You'll see that there are a large number of Asian Pacific Islanders in the San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento, where we are, and that they're also concentrated in areas like right around Seattle and Oregon. And if you were to go onto the New York Times website and look at this graphic, you could actually scan down to the community level and see what the concentrations are within each community. So give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Some of you may recognize this as the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. And the reason why I show this is because I think it really kind of gives us a good idea of our early attitude as a country towards immigration. The idea is that the United States used to be a place where people were free from persecution, that they would actually escape to when they were poor in other countries or if they wanted a new start. They saw the United States as a land of opportunity, and that this was a way in which those who were from lower socioeconomic groups could have a new start and possibly build themselves. In many ways, we think about this as sort of the American dream. And in many ways, we can see now in the contemporary moment, immigration is not necessarily as generous as it once used to be. So here in the United States, in sociology, we study immigrants and immigration for numerous reasons. Number one, it's central to U.S. history and the development of the nation state. In other words, to understand the U.S. as a country, you have to understand the different immigrant groups, what they faced, the history, who easily integrated, and who faced inequality. It helps us interpret and understand inequality, both past and present, in terms of who the haves and have-nots are. It helps us understand political economic conditions that spur migration, but also development in the U.S. and abroad. We'll talk about this more specifically as we move through with this lecture. It also helps us understand the unique identity politics central to the U.S. politics. So it's important for us to have some baseline definitions. So migration, human migration, denotes any movement by humans from one locality to another, sometimes over long distances or in large groups. The movement of populations in modern times continue in the form of both voluntary migration and involuntary migration. Voluntary migration is within or outside of one's region or country. And involuntary migration, which includes the slave trade, trafficking in human beings, and ethnic cleansing. So let me kind of take a moment here on this definition. First and foremost, when we're talking about migration, you actually don't necessarily have to cross borders. There have been a lot of migrations here in the United States that were voluntary, meaning that voluntary migration means that you are making a choice to move. So, for example, when we think about um, the settlers moving west, right, as lands were opened up for settlement, moving into Wisconsin, into Michigan, and other areas. That was a voluntary migration. Another form of voluntary migration might be the Okies from Oklahoma. That when the Dust Bowl set in and they were unable to farm anymore, that they moved it to California for the purposes of being able to um, be able to start new farms or have a better economic outcome for their families. Then, of course, you have involuntary migration, which means that you're forced. So, traditionally, we would understand this to be a form of slavery or indentured servitude, in which one is stolen from their homelands and brought somewhere where they didn't know. This could also include human trafficking that we still see to this day, where people are trafficked for the purposes of the sex trade or for labor. But also, another form of involuntary migration would be the Trail of Tears, in which Native Americans were forced off their lands and forced off of their sort of cultural sites and onto the reservations. That's another form of involuntary migration. So, note that migration, again, doesn't mean you cross borders, it just means it infers or talks about movement. Now, when we are specifically talking about things like immigration, that's when we're talking about international migration. So, international migration is moving from one nation state to another for work, education, to escape persecution or family reunification. And so, in a lot of the videos, they will talk about this in many different ways. So, this is a statistical portrait of the foreign born population in the United States. The reason I show these statistics is to provide you an example of how much the foreign born population has grown in the United States. When you look at the overall foreign born population, before 1990, there was about for Mexico. There was about a little over 4.1 million Mexicans who resided here in the who resided here in the United States. But if you look at the numbers from 1990 and 2000, you basically see that in about a 20-year span, or at the time that in about a 20-year span, the number of foreign-born individuals who are from Mexico here in the United States nearly tripled. So that our total that you saw another 3.6 million arrive between 1990 and 1999, and another 3.7 million in 2000 or later. When you look at South and East Asia, you see similar growth patterns, with 3.7 million being here before 1990. An additional 2.5 arrived between 1990 and 1999, and another 3 million between and 2000. So what's important to note about these statistics is that that there's a very specific sort of precipitating piece of policy that was very influential in the growth of the foreign-born population, and that's the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. This particular act allowed immigrants who were legal permanent residents and those who had become citizens to sponsor family members over. This could be their adult children and their spouses. This could be their spouses themselves. It could be brothers and sisters. And while when the policy was written, it was initially designed to try to create greater migration from Western Europe. It had the unintended consequence of really actually opening up migration from countries such as from Latin America as well as from Asia. Here you see the top 20 sending countries to the United States. It's important to note that immigrants from Mexico total more than the remaining 19 countries. This was taken from the Census Population Survey. Not a lot of surprises here, but the top 5 sending countries are Mexico, China, Philippines, India, and El Salvador. One of the reasons why so many immigrants come from these areas is because they are also supporting families back home. And so remittances are the monies that are sent back to their home country, are an important part of the sort of economic landscape. So who hires immigrants, right? And so I wasn't able to pull up the most recent one. So this particular table is from 2005, but not much has really changed. in terms of percent, in terms of overall percentages, although the raw numbers have changed. The occupations which actually have the greatest number of people who are immigrants working in them are farming, fishing, and forestry. So basically doing agricultural work. Construction and extraction. Extraction is like mining, which has 11.3%. The immigrant share is 25.9%. In agriculture is 43.7%. Building, cleaning, and maintenance is 34%. So that's janitorial work. Food preparation is refers to like fast food work, and immigrants make up about 24% of that population. Transportation and moving is 7.2%. Personal care and services, those are like nannies and housekeepers. Those make up about 16.6%. So you basically see that most immigrants work in service industries in which they are providing services to individuals and helping them in some areas that used to be sort of more household duties. So, what makes an individual undocumented? So, a part of the reading that you had to do this week had to deal with undocumented immigration. I want to be clear here that I, for personal and political reasons, make the decision to use the word undocumented and not illegal aliens or illegal, because as you'll see here, individuals who are here tend to be out of status. They simply do not have the right paperwork, and that people are not illegal, but actions are illegal. And so, if we are using actions like they're out of status to mean that they're illegal, then it should also be that any person who commits any kind of crime, regardless of what level it is, whether you shoplifted as a kid or you've love tapped someone's car and then drove away without writing a note, or if you've broken the speed limits, all those actions are illegal. But that doesn't make you illegal people. So that's just to explain it. If you use it in your own parlance, in your own writing, I don't really care. But I just want to be very clear about why I use the word undocumented. So what makes an individual undocumented? Crossing a border or staying in the United States without a current visa. That visa can be a resident visa, meaning that it allows you to live here permanently in the United States, otherwise known as a green card or legal permanent residence. A work visa and HB1 visa, which basically means that you are sponsored by the government. Not the government, I'm sorry, you're sponsored by your company to work here. A student visa, which basically indicates that you are a college student, usually a college student, in some cases a high school student who is here to learn, or you're here on a tourist visa, that you're actually here to look around the United States and to visit different sites. It's important to note that the length of time that a person can be here depends. Oftentimes, for example, with student visas, you need to renew once every 2 years. A work visa can be renewed up to 5 years. It really depends on what country you're from and what our foreign relations are with that country. So for the tourist visa, for example, with some countries, your visa will last only 2 weeks, and others you can stay here up to 6 months. And the same can be said if you're a U.S. citizen visiting other countries. Some places you're allowed to stay for, like Panama, for example, you could stay for 29 days continuously, and then you actually have to leave or stamp out and come back in if you want to stay longer. But you could also visit a place like the European Union where you're allowed to stay for up to 90 days. You could also be undocumented if you've never had a visa, meaning that you came to the United States without any of this paperwork in hand. Oftentimes, you could have what we call a legal visa and you let it lapse, meaning it expired. So you overstayed your student visa or your worker visa. Or you also can be undocumented if you failed to switch types of visas. This oftentimes will happen for people who are here on a student visa and then started working. They don't actually do the proper paperwork to convert their visas over. You can also be undocumented if you're working in the United States without what we call an I-9 verification. If you've ever had to work, you have to fill these out where they ask for a social security card and and an additional government-issued identification. So you basically need to show a passport or driver's license and a valid social security number. You may also be a child who crossed the border without proper authorization, meaning that your parents brought you without authorization or let your paperwork lapse. There's other ways in which an individual can also become undocumented that I don't have listed here. You can be someone who left your country fleeing because of violence, because of personal abuse or religious persecution, and that when you come to the United States, you're seeking what we call as asylum. And so, if your asylum case is denied, you are considered undocumented or quote unquote illegal. It's also until that paperwork goes through, you're also here without status as well. So there are numerous issues facing immigrants. It's important to note that there are no legal paths to immigrate for low skilled workers. So here in the United States, in all of those industries that I listed earlier, construction, agriculture, food work, as well as nannies and housekeepers, these are all demand areas. Today, if you wanted a job in any of those areas, you can get a job. And these are jobs that Americans tend not to want to go into because of, in particular, the low pay and hard hours. And yet, we don't have anything policy wise that actually helps low skilled workers come to the United States. In the past, before 1980, immigrant workers used to sort of ebb and flow, meaning they would come to the United States, work seasonally, and then go home, and then would come back when it was needed. So the migration was an ebb and flow between the country of origin and the United States. Now there are no programs. In the past, like in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, we also had the Bracero program, which was a binational agreement between the United States and Mexico, which sponsored, in particular, agricultural workers to come to the United States and work. All of those programs are gone and are not there. And so one of the things that's important to note is that there's a demand for those jobs, and for many immigrants, they're living in countries in which economies have collapsed. So, for example, take the example of Mexico. In Mexico, with the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, this led to a huge flooding of their markets with corn, because the United States had produced too much and they wanted to be able to sell it. So they imported it to, or exported from the United States into Mexico. What essentially happened is that this collapsed the entire agricultural industry in Mexico, as has been talked about by Carolina Bank Munoz in her book. And she basically, in that book, discusses the fact that as the corn industry collapsed and agriculture collapsed there, these immigrants still needed to make a living. So many of them migrated to cities to work. And in particular, a lot of these immigrants moved to cities where they thought they could work in the tourism industry. So Cancun, Cabo San Lucas, Acapulco, right, Puerto Vallarta, any of these sort of areas that have a lot of tourism. But there weren't enough jobs for the number of people who needed it. And these individuals also needed to be able to support their families. And I think, like most of us, in the face of the fact that that their families really needed the work and the money and the stability, many of them decide to migrate without papers for many different reasons. And one of them is that there is no legal path for low-skilled workers. And then also, secondly, that legal paths that do exist take years to navigate. So, for example, a lawful permanent resident trying to bring a spouse or child from Mexico must wait 7 to 15 years. So imagine that you have this immediate economic need and your family really needs you to work and needs the money to be coming in. Are you going to wait for 7 to 15 years to migrate, particularly if you know that there are jobs? A long-term permanent resident trying to bring a brother from the Philippines must wait up to 23 years. So here we're seeing that these lines are a decade or two long. And I think that the other important thing to note is that for a lot of the individuals who are coming to work, we could create new policy that gives them taxpayer ID numbers or those kind of things, and it'd be and they would be able to pay taxes. They still can't. I'll get to that in a second. But there are many ways in which we could help facilitate work or work for these immigrants. Also, if you've been reading the newspapers lately, you know that the agricultural industry is really scared about the current proposal to build a much higher wall to police the border even more. They are projecting, particularly in a lot of them in California, as well as a lot of the Midwest region, that they're going to have worker shortages because of the so-called building of the bigger border wall. And so these policies have very real implications for our economy as well as for the lives of these individuals. So, undocumented immigrants, according to the Pew Research Center, there are 11.1 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States. This is down from 12.2 million in 2009. So, all of the research has actually shown that despite the discourse that says that we have undocumented immigrants flooding the border, actually the number has decreased. This 11.1 million number also includes asylum seekers fleeing persecution, students overstaying visa terms, workers who could not get a visa, family members who came to join loved ones. So it's sort of everybody in one big sort of pot. It's also important to know that approximately 55% came without permission, so these are people who never had authorization to enter the United States, but 45% came here on a legal visa and then overstayed that visa. So, unlike the discourse that says that everyone is crossing the border, flooding the borders, in fact, 45% of people are actually overstaying legal visas. 6 states account for 59% of the unauthorized immigrants in 2014: California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. So this is probably not all that surprising. This particular graph gives estimates of unauthorized immigrant populations, and it basically grew in 6 U.S. states and declined in 7 of them. Those marked in orange: California, Nevada, Iowa, Illinois, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina all saw decreases in undocumented immigration. We saw increases in Washington, Louisiana, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. This particular graph shows that there's a larger share of unauthorized immigrants who are long-term residents. There's a rising share of unauthorized immigrants have lived in the U.S. for a decade or longer. So if you look at that top line, that's sort of the reddish color, we're seeing that in 2014, 66% of unauthorized immigrants have been here 10 years or longer, and that there's a declining share of unauthorized immigrants, or about 14% of adults in 2014, who have been here for 5 years or less. So basically, part of the story that's going on here is, as we've had stricter enforcement of the border, it's not only keeping people out, it's also keeping people in when we build border walls. So people are staying here for longer amounts of time for economic reasons, because the journey is so perilous, and because it's so dangerous to cross the border. We often hear in discourse, well, why don't they just get in line? It's important to note that no line is available for the vast majority of unauthorized immigrants. Immigration to the U.S. is generally limited to 3 routes: employment, family reunification, or humanitarian protection. And when we talk about employment, those are more like tech industries like Google or Yahoo, right, or Microsoft. We're not talking about agriculture or some of the sort of low-skill areas. Each of these areas are highly regulated and subject to numerical limitations and eligibility requirements. So it's extremely hard to get these types of visas. Worker visas require a U.S. employer to request specific foreign workers. So, in other words, the company has to show that this individual has a particular set of skills, and that they are actually gainfully employed by that organization. Family-based immigration is limited to certain close family relationships and is also numerically restricted, meaning that, so for example, Mexico, that family member immigration or immigration related to sponsoring a family member over may be capped at 100,000. And so once it hits that limit, no additional people are allowed in for the year, which accounts for some of that backlog that we talked about on the previous slide. Most people fleeing their home countries cannot access humanitarian protection. So one of the things to remember is that asylum is a very political issue that the United States will determine based on their own sort of foreign policy. So, for example, if you look at Nicaragua in the 1990s, there were a number of professionals, doctors, lawyers, educators who were being assassinated. But because the United States had covert military actions going on, and that they had actually supplied some of the guns to those that were executing those educators, those professionals, etc., they were unwilling to grant asylum to many from Nicaragua. So we see this with Vietnam, we see this with Cuba. It all sort of depends on which group and the timing. There are numerous backlogs and waits, as I've already talked about. Even those who can get in line are subject to long backlogs and waits. Demands from both family members and workers is typically higher than the number available each year. There are a maximum number of employment-based and family-sponsored preferences visas issued to citizens of any one country in a single year. Sorry, I'm being redundant there. Um, as of May 2016, for most countries, unmarried children of U.S. citizens must wait more than 5 years, and siblings of U.S. citizens must wait for more than 10 years. People from countries with high levels of immigration to the United States, like Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines, have longer waiting times. And as we've noted, for example, married children of U.S. citizens from Mexico must wait more than 20 years for a visa to become available. And Filipino siblings of U.S. citizens currently wait about 25. So what I'd like you to do is just very quickly read through the next couple of slides, because it sort of tells you who these individuals are. The most important bullet on this slide is the fourth one. Note that undocumented men have a 96% labor force participation rate. So a lot of times there's this portrayal of the idea that undocumented immigrants are freeloading, that they're not working, but in fact they're actually working at very high levels. They have 96% labor force participation. Some of the numbers that we've seen on women are equally high. I just haven't found a study, a reliable study that also gives this data. So it's important to note that immigrants come to the U.S. without documents for many different reasons. It can be the collapse of the economy in their home country. There have been free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the African Free Trade Agreement, that have essentially collapsed industries in many sending countries, forcing people to find work to help their families. They often come to escape wars and violence. They also come to escape persecution based on ethnicity, gender, religion, and or sexual orientation. Oftentimes they also come for work or for school because the systems here are stronger. So there are numerous reasons why people come without documents and try to survive. They come here as a way in which to enrich their lives, not enrich their lives, but to try to make their lives better and to contribute, and that they are oftentimes working even though we don't have formal mechanisms to measure what they're doing. It's also important to note that for undocumented immigrants, economists, regardless of their political persuasion, have largely argued that undocumented immigrants are the reason why we still have Social Security. Right now, with the baby boomers who are retiring, people like my mom, there are more people who are retired than there are actually kind of in their 40s working. And the problem is that they actually count on those of us who are between the ages of, especially about 30 to 50, to really essentially help pay for Social Security. If it wasn't for the fact that that undocumented immigrants contributed millions of dollars into the Social Security system that they will never be able to take out, we would actually not be able to keep Social Security alive. They contribute to the United States through work and entrepreneurship, and that immigrants tend to boost economic growth by hundreds of billions of dollars. It's projected that they will boost economic growth by hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade. This is through their work in agriculture, produce, working, etc. It's important to note that immigrants comprise approximately 15% of the U.S. labor force, and they figure prominently into key economic sectors of the U.S., including agriculture, construction, and services. And immigrants accounted for almost half of the increase in labor force in the U.S. between 1990 and 2000. So the National Academy of Sciences reports find that the tax payments generated by immigrants outweigh any costs associated with services used by immigrants. So keeping in mind, things like welfare cannot be accessed by undocumented immigrants. You must be a U.S. citizen to be able in order to access those services. A 2013 report showed that undocumented immigrants have lowered the wages of U.S. adults without a high school diploma, 25 million of them, by anywhere between 0.4 to 7.4%. In states with more undocumented immigrants, skilled workers made more money and worked more hours. The economy's productivity grew, and from 1990 to 2007, undocumented workers increased legal workers' pay in complementary jobs by up to 10%. Meaning, if they worked in the same area, they tended to help raise documented workers' pay. According to the Social Security Administration, undocumented workers contribute about $15 billion a year to Social Security through payroll taxes. They only take out about $1 billion. Very few undocumented workers are eligible to receive benefits. And over the years, undocumented workers have contributed up to $300 billion, or nearly 10% of the $2.7 trillion Social Security Trust Fund. So it's important to know when people say they're not contributing to society, that's actually a lie. The other thing that we want to be clear about is immigrant detentions or deportations. Congress requires the agency to. So part of what's happened in recent years is that we've enacted a quota system. So Congress requires that any agency that they hire to basically open up a detention center, that they maintain a level of not less than 34,000 detention beds at any given time. This quota was first enacted in 2007, and it appears yet again in the 2000. And it appeared again in the 2015 appropriations bill. That's actually was passed. Is not currently pending in the House of Representatives. In fiscal year 2013, 441,000 people were detained per year. The cost per day is $124 for adult detention, $343 for family detention. There was over 209 facilities in the United States, and 62% operated by private companies. The story here is this is where you see the collision in many ways between the mass incarceration system and the immigration system. The same companies that own the increasing number of jails that have been privatized also own these immigrant detention centers. And by actually having this allocation of 34,000 detention beds, basically means that it is a money-making endeavor for many of these corporations at the cost of individuals being detained. It's also important to note that as you may have seen in the very first exercise that you had to do for this class, that President Obama has deported more people, more immigrants during his 8 years in office than the previous 4 administrations before him combined. Part of the story of what's happening is what we call militarization of the border. This refers to the increased presence of police and national security agents along the border, in addition to the strategy of policing the southern border through 2 specific strategies, what we call low-intensity conflict and prevention through deterrence. This is a picture of what the enforcement sectors look like. As you'll see, particularly in the Southwest, that's where actually a lot of our work is, a lot of the immigration enforcement is taking place. And that's where the U.S.-Mexico border is, starting from the San Diego sector through El Centro, Yuma, Tucson, El Paso, Marfa, Del Rio, McAllen, and Laredo. This is the area where we've actually seen the growth of the border wall. And there's a couple of things we want to think about. First and foremost, when undocumented immigration was happening, we were first building the wall in the mid-1980s. Immigrants were still able to were crossing in closer to urban areas. So, for example, those who were entering through Tijuana would end up in San Diego, or those who were entering in the Tucson sector would end up in Nogales. Or if you were looking at sort of the McAllen sector or the Del Rio sector, you would go from Juarez into El Paso. These crossings were much safer and had lesser personal risk. And as we militarized the border and we created higher fences, bigger checkpoints, dedicated more individuals or border patrols to these areas, it pushed immigrants out further and further into the desert. And what's important to note about this is that prior to this happening, cartels who were bringing drugs across the border had very separate passage lines from immigration lines. And essentially what's happened as a result is that the U.S., because of how the U.S. has enforced the border, they've actually given the cartels an additional illicit activity which they could add to their list. So not only are they trafficking drugs, but they're also trafficking human people now as well. And these are accounts that we've heard from a number of the human rights agencies on the border. And so it's important to note that the U.S. that no official count is kept of the number of individuals found dead on the U.S.-Mexico border. When people have been pushed out further and further away from cities, they end up in the desert areas. And so when you're in the desert, you can die from dehydration, you can die from heat exposure, element exposure. You can also, during the winters, keep in mind the deserts can also be very freezing cold, and so you can also die of hypothermia, in addition to any other health considerations that can be happening for immigrants who are going on this very dangerous journey. Increased border militarization has pushed migrants away from safer urban crossings, and as a consequence, there's been an unprecedented rise in the number of people dying when attempting to cross. Prior to 2000, the average number of deaths per year in Arizona was 12. Between 2001 and 2014, that average rose more than tenfold to 165 deaths per year. I think one of the things that's really important to note is that for those who've tried to count border deaths at the border, it's been extremely hard because when immigrants die in the desert, wildlife can get to them, and so oftentimes they're only finding body parts. And then also the identification process is very slow and is backlogged, and it can and oftentimes families back home never know what happened to their loved ones. Um, in 2009, the ACLU released a document saying that what was happening at the border was really a human rights issue, and that we were not in compliance with international obligations in the treatment of the dead and their families. It's also important to know that since 1998, more than 6,330 men and women have lost their lives while crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. In 2012, it was estimated that the U.S. spent a total of $18 billion on immigration enforcement initiatives. This exceeds the combined total spending of the FBI, DEA, Secret Service, U.S. Marshal Service, and the ATF by nearly 24%. And so finally, I'm going to leave you with some historic pictures of the U.S.-Mexico border wall. On the left is what used to be, right? Obviously, in olden days, it was much more fluid. People could come and go as they please. We didn't really have these things like border walls. Then we saw, then we saw the border looking like this, where you had this sort of fence that even then people could kind of go over. And now this is sort of the contemporary picture. This is, if you look at the top left, we can see that it become extremely difficult to come into the United States. That's traffic coming into the U.S. I believe that's at Tijuana. We also see how high it has been in their surveillance in the top right corner. And then on the bottom, we actually also see that they actually spent billions of dollars to extend the border wall actually out into the ocean, and this is down in San Ysidro. So there was a lot of information here in terms of the lecture. Please go back and review the slides as necessary, but it gives you kind of a portrait of immigration in the United States now.